The third talk for the day is titled Development of a Wirelessly Powered Implant System for Multisite Cardiac Pacing, which is to be delivered by Mathews M John, who is a research engineer at Texas Heart Institute. Before starting the talk, I'll give a brief bio of Mathews. Mathews M John is a research engineer in the Electrophysiology Clinical Research and Innovations Department at the Texas Heart Institute, Houston, Texas, USA. He completed a double major in electronics and communication engineering and earned his MSc in biological sciences at the Leela Institute of Technology and Science, Pilani, and subsequently his master's in bioengineering at Rice University. He has over 5 years of experience developing medical devices, specifically in the cardiovascular therapies. He is responsible for designing and developing novel electronic hardware to develop novel therapies, particularly pertaining to cardiac electrophysiology. He is interested in applying novel techniques and technologies to improve diagnostics and therapy of cardiac diseases. So I welcome Matthews. Over to you now.
All right, thank you, Ananta. Let me share my screen. I just want to confirm that you can see my screen.
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Mathews M John, and I'm a research engineer at Texas Heart Institute here in Houston, Texas. Today, I want to talk a little bit on this wirelessly powered implant system that we are developing primarily for multi-site cardiac pacing. And I want to just run through the development process kind of on a system level and not really go into anything in like super detail. So at the Texas Heart Institute, at the Texas Heart Institute, I work for a department called as the Electrophysiology Clinical Research and Innovations. Basically, it's a mouthful, but what we do is we try to do research and innovations in the electrophysiology space, and that's basically working with the electrical circuit of the heart. We are led by our director, Dr. Mehdi Razavi. He is an electrophysiologist. He's a practicing doctor in the electrophysiology space, but he's also an innovator and an entrepreneur with more than 3 companies under his wing. I'm also joined by a couple of other research engineers, Dr. Allison Post, Skylar Buchan, Drew Bernard, and also another clinician, Dr. Payam Safavi Naini, who does most of the clinical research work in the lab. So the way the lab works basically is Dr. Razavi comes up with these ideas and he comes up to us, the engineers, and tells us, hey, this is a specific need that I am actually facing either in the clinic or in the hospital. What do you guys think about this? Can we develop a process or a device, to as a solution for this? So then what we do is we do a full brainstorm session, and based on the clinical input, we try to develop a device or a process to address that specific need. So for today's talk, I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about the cardiac conduction system of the heart, just to kind of give a primer so as to understand why we are doing this and what is actually happening in the heart. A very brief history of cardiac pacemaker, kind of going into the medical device development process that we follow, and what the wirelessly powered pacemakers look like and what our future holds for that specific project. So getting into the cardiac conduction of the heart, so here's an illustration of what the nerve bundles in the heart look like. So the upper chambers of the heart, that is, so these 2 chambers of the heart are called as the atrium, and there are 2 chambers here on the lower side, they're called as the ventricle. And there are nerve bundles that are kind of distributed all across the heart. So there is an electrical signal that starts off at what's called as a sinoatrial node, which is a very large nerve bundle. And the electrical signal travels through these nerves into what's called as an atrioventricular node. While this activation is happening, the atrium essentially contracts and pumps blood into the lower chambers, which are the ventricles. Now, the atrioventricular node is basically a one-way valve, and it only allows for conduction from the atrial site to the ventricular site. That's kind of an oversimplification, but for the purpose of this talk, let's just go with that. And from the atrioventricular node, the electrical conduction takes what's called as the highway of the heart through the Purkinje fibers. It electrically activates the entire ventricle. And once the electrical activation goes into the ventricle contracts, and the blood is pumped into the lung or into the arteries, as depending on which chamber contracts. So that's basically the electrical conduction of the heart. If pretty much everyone is kind of familiar with this, these squiggly lines, which is called as the ECG. Basically, what you do is you measure these electrical signals from the surface of the skin, not directly on the heart, but on the surface of the skin, and you get this averaged out electrical signal, which is known as an ECG. So in an ECG, you have a PQRS-T waveform with different morphologies. But what's interesting, specifically pertaining to this talk, are these PR intervals and QRS complex widths. So it is to be noted that there are inherent delays inside the heart there is a specific time delay between the atrium contracting to the ventricle, and there are also delays between each of the ventricles contracting. These are inherent to the heart. So any perturbation on top of this will, if you are mimicking it as best as possible to these inherent delays, then that is the most optimal therapy. So when you program therapy, you kind of have to get it to those optimal settings as best as possible per patient, but it's not always easy. So what is a cardiac pacemaker? So before that, let's think about why we need a cardiac pacemaker and why the therapy even exists. The interesting thing about the human body is that it kind of follows Murphy's law. No matter which organ you take, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. In the cardiac realm, in the cardiac electrophysiology realm, that means the electrical conduction can be slow, just in the atrium or just in the ventricle. It could be fast, just in the atrium, just in the ventricle. It could be synchronous while being fast or slow, or it could be completely asynchronous, creating what is called as an arrhythmia. Some of the arrhythmia can be fatal. What we typically call as a heart attack could lead to what's called as a ventricular fibrillation, and that could be fatal. So knowing all of this and understanding the etiology of all of these problems, what we can do is we can electrically stimulate different parts of the heart to help it go either faster or slow it down a little bit, or even therapeutically address arrhythmias. So a pacemaker, simply put, is an electrical stimulator attached to the heart that delivers therapy in response to a sensed event. Modern pacemakers look like this. You have what's called as a can. The can essentially houses the battery and all of the electronics in it. And you have a lead, which is basically a very long wire with electrodes at the tip of the wire, and that can be attached directly to the heart. Usually, the can sits pectorally under the skin, and the wires essentially go through what's called as a subclavian vein, or it's a vein that is attached directly, or that is connected directly to the heart, and you have these leads going into different chambers of the heart. If you look kind of inside any of the pacemakers, no matter which vendor it's from, on an average, the major space of the pacemaker is taken up by the battery. The reason being, implanted pacemakers are meant to last for 5 to 10 years, and they have to in some cases, continuously give therapy for 5 to 10 years. So they have to last for that long. So you have a very large battery with relatively small electronics in comparison to that, and some mechanical connectors for connecting to the lead, and also electrically connecting to the lead. So just to kind of give you a brief history of cardiac pacing, it started off in the early 1950s when the first wearable battery-powered pacemakers were made by Lillehei and Buchan. So in this picture, you can actually see this child is holding a very large pacemaker. So it's almost like a case that they had to hold. But by the 1958, Elmquist and Senning made the first implantable pacemaker with discrete components. Somewhere after that, there was a lot of interesting research into battery technology, pacemaker technology, sensing, and all of that, to a point where somebody actually suggested using nuclear batteries in implantable pacemakers, which I found kind of hilarious. But anyways, for the next 50 years or so, nothing really happened. Algorithms improved and so on and so forth until we had our modern pacemaker. But in 2016, the FDA approved what is called as a leadless pacemaker. So the leadless pacemaker, in a sense, gets rid of this long wire that is coming in from the outside into the heart. So the Leela Spacemaker is an extremely small self-contained device that can be deployed directly into the heart, and it can just stay there, and it can pace for about 5 to 10 years or so. Again, the majority of this leadless pacemaker is taken up by the battery, which is kind of housed about this big. Of course, nowadays nobody uses that many discrete components in a pacemaker. Everything has moved over to ASICs with a couple of external components, external passes to help out with the pacing. So why were leadless pacemakers built? Well, so if you look at this picture here of what and the therapy is called as biventricular therapy, where you have leads in both the ventricles and also one in the atrium, where you have 3 different wires going from the can into the heart. So if you look at this, at this point where the leads are going into the subclavian vein, there is a potential for infection, and that can actually be quite problematic for patients who are pacemaker dependent. The other problem is, if you look at here, there's a valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle. If you have a wire that's sticking through the valve may not close, even if it's a relatively healthy patient. And that can cause what's called as a tricuspid regurgitation, where the blood flows back from the ventricle into the atrium. So that's not supposed to happen. And over time, the valves mechanical function can actually deteriorate. The last bit is lead dislodgement, where the leads can actually come out or fracture because of all the continuous mechanical movement, across 5 to 10 years. So knowing all of this, it was very evident that pacemakers, while they are really useful and while they're really good, are still limited to complications because of the leads being there. And that's what prompted the innovation for creating leadless pacemakers. However, leadless pacemakers are not, in its current form factor or current size, it's not like the best device, mostly because it's so because of the form factor, it is limited to single chamber pacing, whereby leadless pacemakers are typically kept only in the right ventricle and it cannot pace anywhere else, which is problematic, especially in a patient like this who requires 3 different areas of stimulation. Additionally, implantation requires a much larger device, which can potentially lead to implantation-related complications. Implantation-related complications. So knowing all of this, knowing all of the limitations of these leadless pacemakers, we thought of a way, okay, can we improve on this? Can we do what we are claiming to be multi-site pacing without the battery being there? Can we actually miniaturize it even further so that it'll stay there without disrupting motion of the cardiac motion, but at the same time being able to deliver pacemaking therapy. So let's just look at the medical device design process, and this is from an FDA medical device design control document, and this is kind of the general rule that pretty much all medical device manufacturers or development teams follow. So it all starts with the user needs, and this is quite important because in the medical device space, you have to make sure that there is an absolute need that you're addressing, because if not, it is quite hard to convince a doctor that what they're doing is wrong, or if there's no value to the patient, then there's no point in actually making the device. So the user is also important, because the stakeholder of the device could be a doctor, a nurse, a field engineer. It could be in the ICU clinic, as the previous speaker was mentioning, or It could be in a hospital setting, or it could be in a community health setting. But no matter where it is quite important to understand the user needs, because that drives your design input. Which drives, okay, what should the system look like? What should these subsystems look like? What are the requirements of these systems? And how should the specifications be built around those requirements? Then it's an iterative process where you kind of iterate towards those specifications using multiple verifications. So verification is basically a testing method whereby you are verifying that you're meeting all of your system requirements. This is in the bench. You do not meet a patient. You do not do any preclinical research. There are no in vivo studies involved in this at this stage at all. There might be ex vivo or in vitro studies, but never an in vivo study. But once you have that initial iteration of a medical device, you go back to that user, again, be it a doctor, field engineer, or nurse, and then you validate it with them. Have I addressed what the user is looking for? If you have, then great. Let's move on to manufacturing this and then trying to sell it. If not, you go back into this design input phase and then keep iterating it until you are ready to push it out in the market. Of course, there are external factors like business needs, regulatory needs, and so on and so forth that also drives this. But in general, when you're looking at purely the engineering side of things, this is this is exactly how the design process works. So, like I said, so we decided to get rid of the battery, and one way we thought of doing that was to create wirelessly powered pacemakers. So essentially, these are inductively powered chips, which are somewhat high efficient power harnessing ICs, capable of getting that power and then converting it into a DC stimulus. Sorry, a stimulus enough at different frequencies and different pulse widths to stimulate the heart. So let's assume that there are different nodes in the atrium, again in the ventricle, left ventricle, and in the right ventricle. So these nodes will communicate with an external controller via wireless transmission. Again, this includes communication and also wireless power transfer. And when that communication is done, the controller would say, okay, go ahead and pace with this specific frequency, with these delays, and at this specific pulse width, and which prompts these devices to stimulate at those specific locations based on what the controller is saying. Now, I do want to mention that this is not being developed fully at Texas Heart Institute. This is a collaborative work between Texas Heart Institute, UCLA, and Rice University. It's funded by the NIH and the NSF, which are federal funding agencies here in the US. So kind of going into each of these subsystems that are there for the wirelessly powered pacemaker. The electrical subsystem has a couple of features. One, the major one being the pacemaker node. This is an earlier version of the node, which has a constant voltage output, where the frequency and the pulse width can be controlled by modulating the radio frequency that's actually going into the node. This IC has an extremely low footprint, which is about 0.85 to 0.45 millimeter square, and wireless power transfer has been shown to be within the SAR, or the specific absorption rate limits set by the IEEE. Kind of an oversimplified look on what's happening inside the node. You have the radio frequency that's coming into the node. It gets accepted by the antenna, or it gets tracked by the antenna, by a matching antenna, and then it gets rectified. And there's a specific voltage reference which creates this constant voltage output. And once the voltage reference is met, a switch basically goes in and out, or gets stimulated, again based on the input signal, to pulse the or to create a pulsing output, and that output goes through an electrode tissue interface into the heart, and that's what causes the heart to pace. Now, you do see an LED in here. The LED is of course not required in the for pacing. It is mostly there primarily for visualizing that we have an output, which kind of helps with the testing part of it. We are also creating a sensing node based on a very similar architecture, where we are also switching it on and off with with wireless power transfer. It has about a 10-bit ADC, which samples at around 1 kilohertz, which is quite more than enough for any kind of electrogram, which is the signals directly from the heart. And then it wirelessly communicates it back into the external controller from different locations. And then based on that data, we know what therapy to give at what time. However, when you think about it, when you have three different spatially located nodes that are wirelessly transmitting data, time synchronization of the sense data can get quite hard, and then latency is also quite big, quite an issue. So one of the ways that we thought about avoiding this was, instead of sensing directly on the heart, we came up with this machine learning algorithm that uses ECG signals, which can be fairly easily collected from the surface of the body using extremely low power mechanisms to compute electrogram signals from these ECG signals. So what we did was we had clinical data from about I want to say 12 patients or 14 patients, and we took ECG data from them and also electrogram data from them, and then we fed it through a convolution neural network to see if we can recreate EGM signals from ECG signals. So as you can see here, we did the reverse also, where we took EGM signals and then we converted it back into the ECG signals. We got fairly high correlation coefficients across all patients, and it compared significantly better than a time delayed neural network and linear methods. However, we did realize that there is a small amount of window that has to be trained per patient to give, because generalizing this algorithm is quite hard across different patients. And we wouldn't know if it'll actually work without having a very large study. But what we decided to do, at least for the interim, is that if we can train up the algorithm with about 30 seconds of the data, we could potentially increase the overall correlation per patient. So, and that's not difficult to do. You just get the data when the pacemaker is being implanted. Making machine learning algorithm is well and good. However, everybody knows that it is quite power inefficient, especially for implanted devices which have to last for 5 to 10 years. It is quite power hungry. So what we are also working on, again with Rice University, is to create this framework which can optimize both the neural network and the an accelerator, so that both of that can be created in an ASIC and then deployed into the target pacemaker. And this architecture is quite flexible in you can put your optimization parameters, be it space or be it energy, be it less number of processing elements, or whatever it might be. So you input those into this architecture and say that this is what your input and output should be, and it creates or it generates an optimal accelerator and an optimal network that can again be taped out into an ASIC and then put into a target pacemaker. That's kind of where we are right now. There are a couple of ongoing research. This is still an ongoing research where we still have to figure out the networking capabilities from multiple nodes. When you have, even 3 pacemaker nodes is kind of a challenge, especially with reduced latency and to reduce the power consumption. We are still working on a machine learning algorithm for improved therapy, especially in the biventricular space, where even today about 33% of patients who get the wired therapy do not really respond to the therapy. So we are still working on an algorithm to improve that. The other major thing, obviously, once you make all of this on a PCB or whatever packaging, we still have to mechanically package it such that we can deploy it transvenously into the heart, which is still a challenge. And we are working kind of closely with the clinicians to figure out how to do that effectively and safely. Then obviously, once all of this is done, we have to run a couple of preclinical validation studies, so as to make sure that we are able to safely and effectively deploy the device, safely and effectively get the data, verify it or validate it with wired data, and say that okay, this is the optimal patient therapy. Is this therapy actually working? So that's all ongoing. Hopefully, in the next 3 to 4 years, we will have something that is a fully developed wirelessly powered pacemaker. So that's it. Thank you so much. You can find me on Twitter at Mathews Makes and on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/Mathews M John. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthews. If anyone has any question, they can unmute themselves or type in. Okay, so I was just curious to know that how it will be monitored, like how it's performance of this wireless pacemaker will be monitored.
The performance of the device.
Yes.
Or okay. So typically, when you have an implanted device like this, you have what's called as an IDE, which is an investigative device exemption uh, for medical devices. So what you do is you recruit a couple of patients, and then you go in through an actual clinical study to show that the device is actually effective. Unfortunately, there's no better way of doing it other than proving to the FDA that we have done all of the tests that's required by a regulatory environment to prove that this device is safe for use in a patient. And then you go into the patient and actually use it on the patient, and then make sure that your primary outcomes of safety and effectiveness has been met. And that is largely, can I deliver therapy? Is the pacemaker actually responding to a sensed event? Is it working like a normal pacemaker, and so on and so forth? The typical device design lifetime or timeline for a device like this is about 15 years. That's also why you didn't really see a lot of innovation in the 50 years, in between Elmquist and Senning and the modern pacemaker. So it takes a lot of time, and without clinical data, it cannot be done. So a typical thing that's done in the US is to go out, because of how stringent the FDA is. Many of these clinical studies are done outside the US, primarily in Europe and South America, again, depending on like business needs and regulatory constraints. And then based on that, you have a bunch of papers that come out, and then you prove efficacy.
That's a long process. So we have a question from Sanjeev KM. So you can unmute yourself and ask.
Hello, is it audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry, thanks for the presentation. It is quite engaging. I am not sure whether my Wi-Fi was not good at home, so I thought let me type the question.
Sure.
So what I have typed is, see, typically the domestic Wi-Fi signals or any, not even Wi-Fi, electronic gadgets, or you have a lot of Geo or those kind of devices which generate those kind
EMI
of signals, right? That on the similar kind of frequency band. I'm just wondering that this leadless device, because in US it is federal compliance are different. In Indian perspective, wouldn't it interfere with because it's a life-threatening thing, right?
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, no, that's actually a very interesting and a very good question. It's actually very relevant, and I'll give you an example of why it's relevant in a bit. But the short answer is it won't, because we are using what's called as an ISM band. And whenever we develop these devices, we make sure that every country has which bands are being used for what. So you try to avoid those bands and stay within a bandwidth that doesn't really interfere with the other ones. For our purpose, we are using in the US it's called an ISM band, which is the industrial, scientific, and medical band. In the 13.56 megahertz region. These are not in the gigahertz, so you wouldn't have your 2.4 or 5 gigahertz signal from your Wi-Fi actually interfering with that. And that's kind of true with the telecommunication also, which I think are in the 400 plus megahertz range, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. But essentially, when we do develop for this, we do account for it. However, you do bring up an interesting point of EMI or electromagnetic interference, and this actually happened to a product very recently. When the Apple 12 was released, there was an immediate problem because of the MagSafe wireless charging. The MagSafe wireless charging started interfering with implantable cardiac defibrillators, which are significantly more important than pacemakers because those are the ones that shock you when you have a heart attack. And that became a huge problem. And then I believe Apple had to do something to make sure that the interference was not a big problem. So it is something that is that is accounted for. The FCC here in the US and the EU also has a regulatory body that kind of makes sure that the interference remains low. In addition, any device like this, or even devices that have any kind of wireless communication, for example, current pacemakers, they have to be EMI and EMC compliant per some IEEE standards. So those are accounted for as best as possible. But then again, consumer devices, they have a smaller development timeline. Every 2 years or every 1 year, you have a new device coming up. So the interference of that to a medical device is probably more likely than the other way around.
I see. So yeah, EMC is one. So I assume that 5G and all those bandwidths are different, right?
Yeah,
5G, 6G, 7G, whatever. Mm-hmm. So once you say this interference, I'm just concerned about the security aspect also. If I know, because it is all public domain or whatever. So as a hacker, if I know that this guy is operating on this frequency for this device, and it might be in a home setup or a hospital setup, and I come up with my device and I latch upon that frequency and try to control all the devices which are in the ICU.
Yep.
And I can just put up a potential threat if I'm a hacker.
Yep. So yes, I do understand that, and that again, cybersecurity is definitely a potential problem in the space. But my response to that, at least from our development perspective, we are not looking at the cybersecurity aspect of it because we are not in the product development space yet. It's like super research because we still have to figure out how to get this to work for 5 years, which is kind of a little bit more important. But to your point on the cybersecurity part of it, many of the devices, they try to make it such that you have to be quite close to the device for it to work. I don't have a very valid example of how to do it. The way we are doing it right now is a simple passkey. Passkey has to be there for powering any of the devices. But to your point, yes, if you find out what the passkey is, you could probably pass it. I don't know the answer to that because we are not focusing on that.
Yeah,
but it is definitely something that's.
I understand. There you are. So I mentioned you used that microcontroller, the controller outside the system, right? So
like an external controller, yeah, that's right.
Yes, so external control. So there you are. So if I get the passkey or if I get into the system of that controller, and I'm just outside the hospital, I'm just 1 kilometer distance on a
So on that, no, because the way the external controller communicates with an outside device is by using something that's extremely close. So you need to have an antenna that's actually very close to it. It's not connected to Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or anything like that. It is typically, at least with the modern pacemakers, the way they do it is they have their own proprietary RF communication. So it's and you have to be on the pacemaker which means you have to be like hugging the patient to actually do that. But
Got it. I understood. It looks like a Hollywood kind of thing. But yeah, so if suppose I get my agent in the hospital and I just go to the antenna, and then I have the nurse also involved, and somehow I control the controller outside, then
Oh yeah, of course.
it's sounding like a Hollywood. Anyway,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, it has happened. I think one of the vice presidents had his ICD hacked several years ago. Things have changed quite significantly from then. Cybersecurity is definitely of concern for sure, but you have to be really close to the device. It's not, you can't do it remotely.
Got it. Thanks a lot. Thanks,
Absolutely.
John, for this.
Are there any other questions?
So nice discussion as well, I must say. So thank you for this talk. So I would like to present you. Uh, this-
Oh, sorry. Let me just stop presenting. My bad.
so thank you for delivering this talk. And from our side, we have this virtual flag for you to thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mathews.